Hello there. Starting a new series on the book of James this time. Previously, I went through the book of Acts and the book of Revelation, discussing passages that people think, at least, have to do with how you go to heaven or otherwise how some other people end up going to hell. And so now we're here in James, and you guys might know that this is probably the foremost, most common book that people use to argue against faith alone, or what I would really say is they use it to argue against the message in John 3:16. They use it to argue against John 3:16 because for some reason they make the Bible contradict itself and they think it's really nice theology. Um, but anyway, let me start by giving you a little bit of a story. So I don't know, it might have been about 2 years ago, but I was basically having a discussion with one of my friends on James 2. I'm sure you know what James 2 is if you're watching this video. And I really didn't have any answers for the points he was bringing up. I mean, I spent one night kind of studying the passage and I came up with my own kind of rebuttal to what he was saying, but looking back on it, it's like looking back on a essay that you wrote in your freshman year as a senior. It's just cringy almost, and it's definitely loud because the arguments that I was making were terrible and definitely not worth anything um, substantial. But that kind of did shake me a little. It shook me in a good way to figure out the truth about the passage. And to be honest, I didn't have any answer to I didn't have any real answer to somebody bringing up James 2 or any other passage in James, really. And at that time, I barely even knew how to give the gospel and what the gospel was. And especially, I didn't even know which passages to go to. All I knew was John 3:16. I didn't even know Ephesians 2:8. So that was a while ago, but you might be in that position. You might have somebody approach you with the texts in James and say, see, you're wrong. It's not true that faith alone is how you have eternal life and how you go to heaven. You need works, you need other things, because faith without works is dead, they'll say. And I don't want you to be like me without an answer. And that's how I was, but you don't have to be that way. So consider all these passages in James, because there's a lot of them. In every chapter of James except for chapter 3, there's going to be passages that people use to say that faith alone is not enough to go to heaven. And I want you to think about if you can answer them or not. And here's the thing. If you can answer them, good. But if you can't, you've also come to the right place. And I hope these videos will give you a grasp on how to defend the faith when people bring up passages from the book of James to say that faith alone is not enough. So let's start with a passage in James 1. This is James 1:4. It says, "And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." So what you'll find is people, not too commonly, but people will still bring up this passage and say that, well, you can achieve a state of sinless perfection, and that's what you need to go to heaven. And the way you achieve that state is through endurance. So that means that endurance is a condition to go to heaven, right? Well, no, that's actually wrong. And so one useful tip when you discuss anything with anybody is that you want to focus on the core principles or the core points that their entire argument rests on. And then you can attack that. But I mean, you don't even have to say attack, you can test it because they might be right or they might be wrong, so you test it. And the core matter in this passage is the assumption that the word perfect in Greek means sinless perfection. And of course, as I'm going to argue, it does not mean sinless perfection. It means complete or mature, which is a typical use of the Greek word for perfect. So there's basically three lines of evidence for this conclusion, the conclusion that I present. And again, it's kind of like the literal context, the etymology of the word, and then you have, the whole doctrinal context of the Bible. So first of all, the passage, well, James, actually, the book of James overall is not eternally oriented, it's practically oriented. In other words, it doesn't really discuss how you go to heaven. It discusses the practical aspects of Christian living. We can gather that from nearly every chapter of James. But more than that, if we focus on the word perfect in Greek, we find it has 19 usages throughout the New Testament, and out of those 19, only 2 of them refer to sinless perfection, most likely, and that's James 3:2, and then you have Matthew 5:48. But the other ones don't refer to sinless perfection. They might refer to maturity, they might refer to completion, or they might refer to being perfect in some other way. But the last definition, being perfect in the absolute sense, is probably unlikely overall, because in Hebrews 9:11 we read the phrase more perfect, and obviously if the word perfect itself denoted absolute perfection, there's no such thing as more perfect, so we can conclude that this word didn't necessarily mean absolute perfection, it meant complete or mature. Now, to remember this Hebrews 9:11 passage, you can remember 911. It's the number you call when you're in danger and you need the police to come. So it's kind of like the safety number in your head, if that helps you remember. I don't know. And so one last thing about the etymology of this word, and it also kind of runs into the literal context. Um, in verse 4, which is the one we're dealing with, the word perfect occurs twice, actually. So the passage says, and let endurance have its perfect result. Obviously, perfect there doesn't refer to sinless perfection, because results can't be sinlessly perfect. That doesn't make any sense. What it's saying is let endurance have its complete result. So it needs to have its full result, and that's what perfect clearly means in James 1:4. As well, we know from the Bible that trials, which is the topic of James 1:4, leading to endurance and then its perfect result, completion. We read in the Bible and other places that these kinds of trials actually, they don't produce eternal life, but they produce Christian discipleship growth. That's what we read in 2 Corinthians 12:9, for example. This is a famous passage where Paul says, and he, that is God, has said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. And this is a passage that's about Paul suffering some kind of trial, and God doesn't take it away from him, because, as this passage states, God's power is perfected in weakness, and that's about becoming complete, as James would call it. That's about becoming complete in your Christian discipleship, not about having eternal life. There aren't any passages in the Bible that say that enduring through trials leads to the possession of eternal life. Moving on now, we have James 1:12. It reads, blessed is a man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those who love him. People problematically use this text when they say that the crown of life is the same thing as eternal life. They say that you have to persevere under trial to receive this crown, so it means you have to persevere under trial to have eternal life. And again, the core matter here, the claim that we have to single out, is that the crown of life is the same as eternal life. So let's test that claim. First of all, this crown is conditioned on persevering under trial. John, in his gospel, makes it clear numerous times, so many times, in fact, and so clearly, that the way to receive eternal life is by faith, that we can't say that the crown of life and eternal life are the same, because they have mutually exclusive conditions. How can it be that you receive eternal life by faith, but you also receive it by persevering under trial? Well, that doesn't work, because we persevere under trial so that we receive the crown of life, which is distinct from eternal life. Second, this crown of life is received in the future, whereas eternal life is the present possession of the believer. Therefore, they are different. As well, we know from the Bible that there are other crowns, and those are clearly rewards. There's the crown of life here in James, and then there's 4 other crowns throughout the New Testament, and those are rewards. So what it comes down to is hypothetically, this passage could be using the crown of life phrase to refer to eternal life, but that would only be true if we had reason to believe that it was true. So what people are doing is taking this hypothetical possibility that the crown of life could refer to eternal life, and they're just assuming that it's true only based on the fact that they want it to be true. This is a textbook example of eisegesis, and it's asserting a false premise into the passage that's not there and that you can't derive from any other text or any evidence in the Bible or otherwise. So lastly, we have James 1:15. James 1:15 says, "Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death." So people here want to say that if you sin enough, well, that means you lose eternal life and it gets replaced with spiritual death, and then you're on your way to hell. But here again, the core issue really is what the word death means here in James, or rather how James is using it, because death can mean a lot of things. So, the assumption that people have when they say that this passage is talking about sinning too much and thus going to hell is that they assume that the word death refers to spiritual death. But there isn't any evidence for that. In fact, there's a lot of evidence against that. First of all, the context of James is what we need to be focusing on, and James nowhere discusses the eternality of the soul, or the spirit, really, not the soul. It's actually an important distinction, which I'll get into in another video, between the soul and the spirit. But anyway, James never says, he never even talks about eternal life or eternal hell. What he does talk about is dying physically, and we get that from James 1:21 and 5:19 through 20. But I will say, if you look at these passages, these are going to be the ones that people say do refer to spiritual eternal death, but you'll find in these following videos that I'm going to make that conclusion is completely without evidence, and it is thus to be discarded. Second, throughout the New Testament, death only refers to spiritual death about 2 out of 10 times, and that's almost entirely in Johannine literature, so that really excludes well, it doesn't exclude it, but it makes it very unlikely that James is using the word death to refer to spiritual death, because that almost never happens in the Bible, and when it does happen, it's almost always the author John. So, while that's true, I could even say that this passage is referring to spiritual death, and it wouldn't contradict what I believe. It wouldn't contradict faith alone, and it wouldn't contradict John 3:16. And why is that? Because even if spiritual death were in view, it's not in view, as I stated, this passage still doesn't say that a believer who sins would go to hell, or whatever someone would like it to similarly state. It is true that sin brings death, which is why Jesus gave eternal life. It is no less true that sin brings forth death for the believer, but death can no more upset the eternality of eternal life any more than a box could contain infinity. In other words, yes, sin does bring forth death for the believer, but that is a death for which Jesus fully paid on the cross, and in place of that death is now spiritual, everlasting life. The general principle that James gives, that sin brings forth death, is true on every level, although he didn't intend it that way, but James never said that sin can reverse the everlasting life-giving efficacy of the cross. To argue this way is to severely to severely detract from the point of the gospel. The gospel is that man is spiritually dead because of sin, which is what James says. So Jesus died on the cross, and in place of that spiritual death, you can have spiritual eternal life because of Jesus and through faith. So that wraps up the first part of James, or the first part of this series on James. But there still are some other texts in chapter 1 that we're going to have to deal with, and then we have chapter 2, 4, and 5 to deal with as well. So I hope this video gets you thinking, because it's actually a lot of the things that I mentioned in this video are going to be the basis for arguments I make in future videos on James and even in other books of the Bible. And typically, It's that a word is misdefined, or people using some faulty logic to come to some faulty conclusion, and all it takes is some honest consideration. And so I hope you see that I'm not trying to misconstrue anything. I'm not trying to misrepresent the facts, but the facts are what I gave, and that means that these passages which I listed, James 1:4, 1:12, and 1:15, are not talking about how to go to heaven. It's eisegesis. It's reading into the text to say that they are, because all evidence points otherwise. So again, if you disagree with me, you can put it in the comments why you disagree, and I'll get to responding to that comment pretty shortly, actually. But in but until the next video, thank you for watching this one. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for taking the energy, and thank you for hopefully focusing. I don't know if you did, but if you didn't, I probably need to make my videos more interesting. But thank you again, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Please like and subscribe, and talk to you later.